Will you all join me in singing the Shalom Aleichem? Shalom Aleichem, Malchei HaToretz.
Mississippi's oldest Jewish congregation, Temple Benet Israel in Natchez. The congregation is smaller now than at any other time in its 150-year history, but the temple continues, a living symbol of the resiliency of Judaism.
This temple means a great deal to me, and I wanted to persevere until the last of us have just shut the light because we've gone.
I felt like whenever I walked through one of the doorways of the temple that I was right at home. I felt like, I think it was, it almost could have been a security blanket.
The temple means wonderful memories for me. My parents, my children growing up in this temple, my children being confirmed in this temple. My roots are here.
Natchez was the major city in the South, even more so than New Orleans, for quite a few years. And Jews have been here for most of the history of Natchez.
Natchez was founded in the early 1700s. With the invention of the cotton gin, cotton became king.
It made many, many, many multimillionaires around here. And my great-great-grandfather, who lived right across the street over in Stanton Hall, he was in the cotton business.
Natchez was booming, drawing Jewish immigrants to settle there.
When John Mayer came here in 1840 and had raised 14 children, and Aaron Beekman raised 14 children, and they began to intermarry, before you knew it, you had the growth of a community.
Jewish immigrants opened small stores under the hill, selling supplies to cotton planters and farmers. They had no rabbi and met above members' stores, in private homes, even in the fire station. In 1843, following the formation of a burial society, the Hevra Kedusha, the members of the society established a congregation bearing the same name. Soon after came the first members' graves. Life was not easy in this frontier land.
It's very sad. You get a feeling of what happened in those days, because Natchez, as many parts in this area, was ravaged by the yellow fever periodically, and you can look at the grave markers and see how within days a whole family might have been decimated.
When the Civil War engulfed the South, Natchez's Jews fought for the Confederacy, the first, but not the last, example of their dual identity as Jews and as Southerners.
My grandmother told me this story. One of her grandfathers, a man named Moses, last name Moses, had been a matzah baker and lived in New Orleans and had played the piccolo and led a band for the Confederacy.
During the war, Civil War, the only bombardment of the Union forces that had a boat in the river hit under the hill, and little Rosalie was about 7 or 8 years of age. She was hit. But the family were fleeing from the burning streets and so on under the hill. They were trying to get out of the way, and her father said to her, "Rosalie, get up, Rosalie, get up." It touches me so much. She said, "Papa, I can't, I'm killed." And she died the next day. She was killed. And the only casualty in Natchez of the Civil War.
After the war, the old plantation system for growing cotton was dead. Farmers were penniless, with no way to finance their cotton crop. Jewish merchants suddenly found themselves at the center of Natchez's economy.
They were the main cotton factors. They would lend money to farmers and probably were the only source of money, so that in the post-Civil War days, so that farmers could get their crops planted and buy seed.
They were cotton buyers, they were wholesale dry goods people who would take immigrants and give them packs on their back to become peddlers.
Never more than 5% of the population, they operated a third of the city's businesses from the end of the Civil War well into the 20th century.
In many ways, our town was culturally and socially and economically dominated by our Jewish citizens.
We can see, for example, how numerous and prosperous they were because they had so many pictures made. I don't think Natchez would have prospered had it not been for the Jewish community. And Natchez, they made Natchez a trade center.
They really kept our economy going. There wouldn't be a whole lot here today had it not been for that Jewish community. You can really study the buildings of Natchez and get an idea of what an important role they played, because almost all of our great late 19th century, early 20th century houses, our downtown commercial buildings, all were built by our Jewish citizens.
Baru Atoy Adonai, Eloheinu melech olam, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvoso, b'tzibanu l'hatlet ne'er shel Shabbat.
We are charter members in the American Reform Movement simply because they wanted to have a religion here, but they didn't know how to handle the Hebrew, and they wanted an Americanized service. In fact, the concept of an Americanized service and the Reform Judaism almost broke up this congregation, because when it came time to build a synagogue, the Orthodox had wanted the synagogue with a bema, with women on the side, and of course the Reformed wanted it just like the church that they're used to seeing. The original Reformed synagogue was dedicated by the father of Reformed Judaism, Rabbi Isaac Meyer Wise, dedicated this first synagogue.
After almost 30 years, delayed by the Civil War, Natchez's Jews finally had a synagogue, but their celebrations would be short-lived.
I was perhaps 3 years old or 5 years old when the temple burned, the original temple, which was a frame building, burned about 1903.
I think the Methodists invited, and perhaps other denominations, invited the Jewish congregation to have their services in their churches. And this was reciprocal. There were times when some of the Gentile churches had problems, and they were invited to have services in the temple. It was that integrated, which I think is rather unusual.
It took about 2 years for the congregation to raise the funds necessary to restore the building itself.
This was built for $20,000 back there. You can imagine how cheap money was. Everything in for $20,000.
The rededication of this building must have taken place something around 1905.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one.
Temple Benet, Israel is an important piece of American architecture. It's one of our best early 20th century buildings. We actually have a little riddle for school children when we send them on an architectural scavenger hunt that says, I alone am surmounted by a dome, but I have few members who call me home. It's like a time warp. Rather than remodeling with every different decade that came along, they opted to preserve their wonderful building. And it's that much more important to the architectural history of Natchez today because of its outstanding integrity.
B'nai Israel had 141 members in 1906. It was to be its peak membership. Then the congregation began a slow decline. Again, the Jewish community's fortunes were tied to the cotton economy.
The reason the Jews began to leave was, first of all, the boll weevil. When the boll weevil came in the early 1900s, it created an economic depression in the southern states that you'd have to study history to recognize. These were cotton buyers, cotton brokers, cotton dealers, merchants in cotton, and with the boll weevil, it absolutely crippled that economy.
The old ways had to change. Times were hard.
I used to catch the 4 o'clock railway to go to Brookhaven to buy hides from the butchers, and they'd shake those hides and weigh them, and I'd come back at about 9:30 at night.
And every night.
We worked like dogs.
But Natchez came back, and Natchez's Jews, in their dual identity as Jews and as Southerners, were at the forefront in reviving it.
The Jewish community played an important part in the beginnings of Natchez's tourism economy. One of the early queens of pilgrimage was Jane Wexler. In 1932, in the height of the Depression, there were a group of visionary women who decided that people might come to Natchez and pay to see these great mansion houses. Needless to say, the men in the business community, many of them the husbands of these women, thought it was the most ridiculous thing they had ever heard of in their whole lives. But these visionary women, one of whom was Emma Marks from the Jewish community, decided that they could promote Natchez and build a tourist economy. And of course, that's the cornerstone of the Natchez economy.
The picture of the young man in the Confederate soldier's uniform is me, and it was taken when I was the Confederate flag bearer in the pageant. My job was to run in to the auditorium carrying the flag at full tilt and screaming a rebel yell. It was very physical, but everyone stood up.
The Jews fit into Natchez society, I would say, pretty completely. However you want to define society, whether you want to speak of society as being the whole social order, or whether you want to think of it as going to parties and things like that, the Jews were right in the middle of all of it.
In Faraday, they looked upon the Jews that were there as being ordinary people, as being their close friends. And I think something that's really most outstanding, which I'm very proud of, is that who was a Santa Claus every year in the Santa Claus parade in Faraday but my dad?
But the temple was always home, and for many years, B'nai Israel remained a vital, active congregation.
When my family moved here, I think there might have been 100 Jewish families.
Natchez was the son of Jewish life. We used to have people come in from Fayette, Waterproof, years and years ago from Jonesville, Faraday and Vidalia, all the surrounding areas, and this is where everybody congregated. And of course, on particularly the high holy days, it was an old-fashioned reunion, you might say.
At that time, we have a lot of Sunday school rooms boarded on the side of the room, and all those rooms were full of kids. I can't remember the exact number, but there must have been, even at that late date, which would be in the late 40s and the early 50s, we must have had 15, 18, maybe 20, or maybe even a few more kids in the religious school here.
But in recent years, B'nai Israel's numbers have been slowly, irreversibly diminishing. The last full-time rabbi died in 1976. Older members passed away. No new members arrived. The youngest today are in their 50s.
I think that the Jewish life in Natchez started to decline probably in the 50s.
It went down from there drastically and very quickly. It dropped so quickly, in fact, that by the time I grew up and got married and had 2 children, my 2 children were the last 2 children in Natchez of religious school age.
Right today, there are left in Natchez, Mississippi, something like 18 or 19 Jewish people all told.
The sisterhood has only 6 members now, but although we only have so few, we function well as we did in the days when there were many members. We continue to have all of the dinners, Hanukkah, Purim, Passover.
We have a student who comes from Hebrew Union Seminary 1 weekend a month, high holidays through May, about 8 months of the year. And so the other weekends I conduct the services.
Sometimes there are 3, and sometimes there are 2, and sometimes there are 4, and sometimes there's a big crowd of 6.
But we go on and conduct a regular service as if there were 100 people there.
The tiny congregation of today and the immigrants who founded the temple are linked by a sacred shared space and by the determination to keep Judaism alive in Natchez. Temple Benet Israel has a future that does honor to its past.
The time was coming, and it was coming a little too fast, that there would be almost no one left to keep this congregation and this temple functioning.
It would be as if it had never been here. To give an example, for instance, the temple that was in Canton, Mississippi, that just disappeared off the face of the earth. All the artifacts were lost, the history was lost.
We were able to draw up what's essentially a will, whereby this congregation, at such time that it becomes too small to function, will turn the building over to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience for the purpose of a museum in Natchez, a Jewish historical museum.
I'm tickled to death that it's going to be a museum. It should be. It's worthy of being a museum.
Amen. And may the source of peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort to all who are bereaved. Amen. And good Shabbos. Melech Malchei Hamlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Bochem LaSholom Malchei HaSholom Malchei Elyon Mi Melech Malchei Hamlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Bochem LaSholom Malchei HaSholom Malchei Elyon Mimei Melech Malchei Hamlochim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Tzichem LaSholom Malchei HaSholom Malchei Elyon Mimei Melech Malchei Hamlochim HaKadosh Baruch